Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mirjana Morosini and I'm a professorial lecturer here at SIS American University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, 80 years after the Babyn Yar Massacre, Genocide in the 20th Century, organized by American University, the School of International Service. Before we get started, I would like to review a few housekeeping measures. First, the discussion will last for about 45 minutes, with 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers segment. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function, the chat box, at the bottom of the Zoom window. The questions will be visible only to me, the moderator. Closed captioning is available to those who need it, and please click on the option at the bottom of your screens to activate that. We ask that no one record this session. We will be recording the webinar and it will be available on the SAS YouTube channel shortly after it is over. Now let me introduce the panelists. Karel Berkhoff is the co-director of the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure and a historian of Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine and the Soviet Union, and the Holocaust, particularly in Kiev. He is a senior researcher at the NIOD Holocaust at the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, and has published the monographs Harvest of Despair, Life and Death in Ukraine under the Nazi Rule, and Motherland in Danger, Soviet Propaganda during World War II. Our second panelist is Mario Merced. He is the Political Affairs Officer for the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Prior to this assignment, his work at the United Nations has included responsibility at the Mediation Support Unit of the Department of Political Affairs, the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, and the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq. Our third panelist is Andrei Lukash. He is the director of the Institute for Holocaust Studies in Eastern Europe at the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kiev. He is also an associate professor of the History Department as the chair of Central and Eastern European History at the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev, as well as scholarly director of the Center for Genocide and Mass Atrocities Studies at the Faculty of History. His work on modern Ukrainian history He works on modern Ukrainian history with a focus on the military history and World War II Holocaust history in Ukraine and the entire Eastern Front. Our last panelist is Gregory Stenton. He is the founder and president of Genocide Watch. He was the research professor in genocide studies and prevention at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution of George Mason University. He founded Genocide Watch in 1999, was the founder in 1981 and director of the Cambodian Genocide Project, and is the founder 1999 and chair of the International Alliance to End Genocide, the world's first anti-genocide coalition. From 2007 to 2009, he was the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He served in the State Department from 92 to 99, where he drafted the United Nations Security Council resolutions that created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Burundi Commission of Inquiry, and the Central African Arms Flow Commission. He also drafted the UN peacekeeping operations resolutions that helped bring about the end to the Mozambique Civil War. Actively involved in human rights since the 1960s, when he was a voting rights worker in Mississippi, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Ivory Coast and as the Church World Service Care Field Director in Cambodia in 1980. And from 1988 to 92, he was legal advisor to RUKH, the Ukrainian Independence Movement, for which the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America named him Man of the Year in 1992. And then there is me, your moderator. I'm a professorial lecturer, as I said, here at SIS. and I'm a historian of modern Europe, with particular emphasis on Germany and the broader Central Europe, the Balkans, Italy, and modern European imperial possessions. My work focuses on comparative and transnational history of ethnic politics, ethnic conflict and genocide, nationalism, borderland identities, and the history of science and technology. So welcome to our audience, and I would like to start us off with, of course, mentioning that this year marks the 80th anniversary of the Babyn Yar Massacre, also known as Babi Yar Massacre, when in a span of 48 hours, nearly 34,000 Jews were brought to and murdered at the Babi Yar ravine in then Nazi-occupied Ukraine. While the Nazis attempted to hide evidence of the massacre, we have plenty of eyewitnesses and other evidence that indicate the truth and the extent of these atrocities. Babyn Yar became a symbol of the Holocaust, but it is one that is not necessarily that known to the Western audience. We have two historians here with us, Karel and Andrei, and I would like to ask Karel to start us off and tell us about the massacre, the why, the when, and why it happens and where it happens, and just offer also a broader historical context to this particular event, to this particular atrocity. And then we will move on to Andrei and ask to expand and maybe share with us some of the information on the witnesses that were identified, and also tell us a bit more about the Ukraine, the role it plays in the war, the suffering, and more broadly, the war on the Eastern Front, which kind of a war this is and how does it affect what we are seeing evolving here in the late 1941. Karel, please take us off.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for organizing this event. It's really wonderful that you're doing this. And of course, thank you for inviting me. Babi Yar, or Babyn Yar, these days we like to say Babyn Yar, is the best known case of the so-called Holocaust by bullets. That means shooting of Jews near their homes without even registering them. And this event in Kiev of late September 1941, at that time was without precedent in world history, because this was premeditated murder of virtually all the Jews in a metropolitan city in Europe. This had never happened before. And the second reason why it's so remarkable and horrific, of course, is the incredible speed. You have here more Jews murdered in 2 days than in any other single German mass murder. So where did this come from? It came from, of course, ultimately anti-Semitism, but we can briefly have a look at the beginning of the German attack on the Soviet Union. We now know that the killers, and those were the so-called Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing brigades, and the regular German police, in June of 1941, did not have instructions to kill all the Jews. This was a process that radicalized over the months that followed. So in Kiev, then you have this incredible large massacre by Germans, some 1,500. And after this massacre, we see a sort of more continuation. We see now that entire Jewish communities are exterminated as a rule rather than as an exception. That is the pattern set by Kiev, Babyn Yar. And it is also followed, of course, by the month of October, when a whole range of radical German measures are taken. So it really is a moment in the history of the Holocaust that is extremely crucial. It radicalized the killers afterwards as well. So it came from a desire to get rid of the Jews, but that desire was radicalized after the Germans arrived, because a couple of days afterward, Soviet bombs began to explode. They ultimately destroyed a large chunk of the city center, and this drove the Nazis to really speed up what they wanted to do all along. So they wouldn't create any kind of ghetto, but they decided, let's kill them all at once. There was an incredible sense of rage and frustration that these bombs had been allowed to go off, and they really wanted to lash out at the Jews who were, of course, their primary enemy all along. So what happened then is that on a Sunday, the 28th of September, Ukrainian policemen posted an announcement that the Jews had to appear the next morning already with their belongings and valuables at a certain intersection. And if they didn't do that, they would be killed. So in thinking about how the Jews responded, this is extremely important. The known factor was, if you don't go, you will be killed. Extremely dangerous situation. If you go, perhaps there might something come out of that that allows you to live. So this is how it happened. The Jews started working the next day. But of course, they were not deported at all, as the rumor had been. And this rumor had been deliberately spread. They were received through a range of checkpoints where they had to shed their clothes, their belongings, their valuables. They were pushed through an extremely violent corridor, gauntlet, beaten and really traumatized already before they were killed, and then pushed into the ravine and shot there. So the killers were the Einsatzgruppe C, mostly the Sonderkommando 4A, and actually 2 battalions of the regular German police. This is not so well known. So this happened on day 1, but it also happened on the next day. There were more Jews that came and others that had been locked up either in an open space or in garages. So we know this figure, 30,000, and it's really very precise. Actually, it's more or less correct. We now think more Jews were killed afterwards, and it's generally believed that throughout the German occupation of Kiev, maybe some 40,000 Jews were killed in the city. The place called Babyn Yar, a very large ravine, was not only the killing site for Jews, thousands and thousands of others were killed as well. Not necessarily in the ravine, but nearby. And here you have to think about, in particular, Soviet prisoners of war. So this is the thing. We have an extremely quick massacre, utterly unexpected by the locals. They had some inkling that the Germans were anti-Semitic at the time, but they also had memories of an earlier German occupation, 1918. So there was a lot of doubt. What are these men up to? And maybe I should stop talking and allow Andrei to add his comments.
Thank you, Karel. I would definitely like Andrei to maybe shed some light into the exact numbers of the perpetrators, the executioners, and also tell us how many Jews were living in Kiev at the time, in respect to how many were killed, isn't it? So, and just generally maybe give us a sense of Ukraine during the war, and also the activities, the war activities on the broader Eastern Front. Contrary to what people sometimes believe, it was the Eastern Front, that theater that was actually the bloodlands of World War II. Most of the killings happened actually there on the Eastern Front, including Ukraine. So if you would maybe comment a bit on that, and also maybe tell us a few personal stories of who these victims were. Do we know who they were? Were you able through the museum and your other research to unearth some information of that sort? And how much do we actually know? How many victims were identified by now?
Thank you, Mirjana. Thank you for organizing this seminar and for inviting me to take part in this wonderful event, very important event in the eve of 18th anniversary of Babyn Yar tragedy. First, I will start maybe from the end of your questions. Mm-hmm. Most of the people, most of the Jews who've been killed in Babyn Yar ravine, they were ordinary people, women, children, seniors, and people with some kind of illness, disabilities, those people who did not want or who could not simply evacuate from Kiev, who could not leave the city in the eve of entering of the German troops. By the beginning of World War II, the total population of Kiev numbered almost 1 million, and 1/4 of the Kiev population were Jews. But after between Nazi Germany and Soviet Union began, the number of Kiev population dropped because there were conscription to the Red Army, mobilizations to the Red Army, and most of the adult men were conscripted to the Red Army, and they took part in the combatant front. Plus, there was state-organized evacuation of party institutions, communist party institutions, factories, plants, etc., etc. And the employees with their families were moved eastwards to the very distant regions of the Soviet Union. And plus, there was so-called the self-evacuation, where people decided to leave city in the eve of entering of the German troops, being very afraid of enemy coming. And that's why by the moment when Germans appeared within the city limits of Kiev, depending on the historians, the number of Kiev population is quite different, maybe about 300 or 400,000 people. And about 40,000 of them were Jewish people living in Kiev, and almost all of them were killed in Babyn Yar ravine during only 2 days, and killings they lasted on next days as well, because German police battalions, they searched buildings for looking for those people who didn't come, because, for example, I know many examples when when senior people who could not walk by themselves, they simply couldn't show up to the place where they were designated to come, and they were locked in the rooms in their apartments, and the police searched almost every apartment looking for the Jews. And when they opened the door and when they saw the old Jewish lady or old Jewish gentleman, they just simply took them out and gave to their execution squads, and those people were killed a little bit later. Plus, in the second half of October 1941, Nazi Germans, they came to psychiatric hospital, and they killed the patients of the psychiatric hospitals. And they killed all Jewish patients of the psychiatric hospital. And this way, they killed more than 300 disabled person in the psychiatric hospital. And if we are speaking totally about the Ukrainians suffered during World War II, I have to say that Ukraine lost almost 8 million people. And the total number of population of Ukraine before World War II numbered 40 million. So it's right to say that every fifth person that lived in Ukraine have been killed or died during the World War II. And among those 8 million people, 1.5 million or 1,600,000, they were Jews. They were Jews, Ukrainian Jews. So Ukraine this way suffered the great losses during World War II. Ukraine and neighboring country like Belarus, Poland, they were the center of the biggest atrocities they were committed by Nazis in World War II. It was the deepest place. It was the darkest place in the whole occupied Europe, in whole Europe occupied by Nazis. And let's remember that Babyn Yar, it's only one example. It's the symbol of the Holocaust in Ukraine. And according to their researchers, all over Ukraine, there are almost 3,000 places like Babyn Yar, but with maybe smaller numbers of victims. Nobody knows, for example, about the small village of Bogdanivka, where in December 1941, Romanians and Germans killed during 1 week more than 55,000 people. 55,000 Jews were killed in Bogdanivka, or almost 30,000 Jews were killed near Kamenets-Podolsky. And we, unfortunately, Ukraine had so many places like Babyn Babyn Yar, Bogdanivka, and Kamenets-Podolsky, about 3,000 places like that. It's right to say that every Ukrainian small town had their own Babyn Yar, where were killed, for example, maybe 10 people, maybe 10 local Jews, or maybe 100 local Jews, etc. So the Babyn Yar is most well-known place. It's like a symbolic place because this atrocity happened within the limits of the big city, big European city, which Karel Berkhoff just underlined this fact. So this is the short answer to your very deep question, and I believe that we can speak about this long. It's necessary to devote much more time to answer your very complicated question. I hope that I answered.
Absolutely, you did wonderfully at it, and it would be great if we had an opportunity actually to dedicate a whole panel to this particular mass atrocity, because it is only one of many, as you said, when it comes to the Holocaust by bullets. And this is part of the broader effort on the part of the Nazi state to eliminate the Jewish population from Europe, not only to eliminate in some parts, but the entirety of the Jewish population. And this is known as the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question. The other part of it is the one that's most known, I think, especially in the West. It's one of the gassing devices, the gas chambers, the concentration camps. I think from just, teaching on the topic of genocide in general and the Holocaust, that many students and people in general are not aware of this Holocaust by bullets component. And perhaps maybe, Karel, briefly, if you could talk about the timeline in a way. We know that the Wannsee conference, where the final solution to the Jewish question, it's really brought to life and cemented, happens in January of 42. What we are talking about here today is September of 41, but we know that the Wannsee conference was supposed to take place earlier in the, early winter of 1941, but because of the Eastern Front issues going on, that didn't take place. Could you just maybe briefly tell us, how we should compare the effort on the part of the Nazi state for the so-called humane or noiseless killings, and then the Holocaust by bullets? If you could just maybe briefly talk about it a minute or two.
Yeah. I personally don't see that big of a distinction between the killings. The so-called humane killings were extremely violent, also as one looked at it. The first thing to mention, I guess, is that the Wannsee conference was postponed, and when it took place, it didn't really decide that much. The key script was there. We're going to kill all the Jews, and that includes the Jews of Europe, in the sense of west of the Soviet border. Already in October, it was decided we're not going to let the German Jews escape anymore. Let's not allow them to emigrate. You have a decision to kill the Jews of Poland and Serbia. So all things are in place by the fall of 1941. There's a bit of a controversy whether or not Hitler in December of 1941 actually made a significant contribution to the radicalization process. I personally don't see that. I think that the road was open and it was clear they knew what the end goal was. Now the distinction between East and West, it becomes a little blurred the more you look at it. For instance, gassing, right? We know about it. It was in gas chambers, but let's not forget, it was preceded by a different way of gassing in these so-called horrific mobile gas vans. And those were employed in Kiev, not in September 41, but in 1942 and 1943. Again, this is not very well known. It seems the killers were not that much of a fan of this method, but they did employ it a lot. So you see all these acts are taking place all over Europe. Again, the violence is extreme in the East, but let's not underestimate the extremity of the violence in Central Europe, as Jews were apprehended and sent away and so on.
Absolutely. And I would like us here to shift a bit to the broader topic of genocide in the 20th century, and then we'll come back to the individual stories and ask you, Andrei, to offer a bit of the insight on the actual victims here. But maybe just to mention, because of the audience, they may not be aware that genocide it's a legal concept, and it is about the intent. One has to prove the intent. There has to be the intent proven to exterminate in part or in full a group. It is about mass atrocity. The numbers do not matter. Whether the target is a group of 16 people or 11 million people, it does not matter. And the groups within the legal framework, and maybe Maria will talk about that later, it's based on ethnicity, nationality, religion, or race, and or it could be an overlap between one or more categories. Here we see, isn't it so, that the Nazi state is labeling the Jewish others, so to say, as a racial other. They're deeply utilizing race theory and science and biomedical science and the politicization of science to label a group in a specific way. Race does, as a category of identification, it's a construct, but it does hold more power, especially at the time, as many believe that it is based in objective science. We know it's pseudoscience. But we have, in the long 20th century, many other cases of mass atrocity. Genocides happen, isn't it so? Perhaps not as often as people sometimes assume. Ethnic conflict or ethnic cleansing, ethnic conflict ends with ethnic cleansing quite often. Ethnic cleansing and expulsions are much more commonly seen in the 20th century. We do know that the first case of modern genocide is the one that happens in Imperial Europe, in Southwest Africa, as the German Imperial Army implements the annihilation order by one of their generals to exterminate the Herero population. There are many other cases of that nature, and of course, they can be labeled in legal terms as genocide only after the convention is passed in 1948. So I would like maybe to shift now to our other two panelists, Mario and Gregory, to tell us a bit, how, in your case, Mario, your office, or more generally the UN, as it comes to being 1945, deals with what we are seeing here. And same maybe with, Gregory, in your instance also to talk a bit, are there certain signs that point out to a possible, event of mass atrocity? Maria, your office, I know on the mission statement page, which is wonderfully done, you talk about atrocity crimes. In addition to genocide, there are other atrocity crimes. So if you could just briefly tell us what, your mission is, and then also how and what can we do to try to prevent these atrocities from repeating themselves and happening over and over, it seems, again. Please go ahead, Mario.
Thank you very much, Mirjana, and it's an honor to be part of this panel. So I represent today the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. For us, remembering the past and committing to prevent are two sides of the same coin. As you rightly said, Mirjana, the crime of genocide is codified in 1948, but the actual establishment of an office by the United Nations to prevent only comes a lot later. Comes in 2004 because of the study of the United Nations of what it had done wrong when it came to addressing the risks and, sadly, the commission of the crimes of genocide in Rwanda and in the former Republic of Yugoslavia in Srebrenica. At the time, the UN had blue helmets in both spaces, and there were things the organization did not do right. There were things that the civil servants of the UN did not have a mandate to do by the organs, where states are represented at the UN. So there was a lot of investigation on all of that, and at the end of that, it was very apparent that the United Nations needed to have a dedicated capacity to basically see those early warning signs, and try to activate responses by whoever could be in position to activate. So there is a special advisor on the prevention of genocide at the United Nations. This person, Ms. Alice Nderitu, serves at a very high level at the United Nations. She advises directly the Secretary General. So, this direct line of contact in terms of early warning at the UN exists. And basically the function of the special advisor and of her office contains 4 key components. No? Collect information on situations that we believe, if not prevented or halted, might lead to the commission of atrocity crimes. Mirjana, as you said, we don't only talk about genocide, we talk about atrocity crimes and violations. And by that, we mean genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And 3 of these are very, very well codified in international human rights law. But it's not enough with collecting information. We have a function to alert the Secretary General of the UN, and through him, all different parts of the United Nations. We have the role and the responsibility to make recommendations to those who can act upon those risks. And perhaps most importantly, because it's what we do most, although it's the less direct sort of part of the mandate, we have the mandate to work to strengthen the collective capacity to prevent, which basically means try to identify all of those who could be in a position of leverage to do something about a risk and act upon this. No? In this initial intervention, I won't delve too much on what is it exactly that we're looking upon, but let me just say that when we build our recommendations for crimes that have such significant identity components, we talk a lot about strengthening the resilience, promoting diversity, looking at the vulnerability of specific groups. Anti-Semitism is quite central to our conversation today. When you see hate speech that have that component, these are very concerning developments. In terms of our methodology to look at information, and I'll be happy to expand on this if this is helpful in response to specific questions if they come. We do consider that these crimes constitute the commission or the eventual commission of these crimes constitute a process. The actual killing can happen very rapidly, as the example of Rwanda sadly demonstrated us, or some of the sad historical experiences described here today also demonstrate that element of quickness in the commission of the crime, how fast it can be committed. But the preparatory framework, the preparatory environment within which people can be dehumanized, for example, that takes a little bit of time. So if we are able to identify specific risk factors, some of them may be long-term, some of them might be more short-term, some of them will be more explicit, others may be a little bit more implicit. If we're able to identify them and to break them down in a way, then we can also try to identify entry points to address those specific risk factors and identify partners that can help us doing that. At the United Nations, an office like ours, can think of the different ways the UN can be present in a country. The UN can have peacekeeping missions, special political missions with different responsibilities. We can have colleagues working on education, colleagues working on development, colleagues working on peace building, colleagues trying to bring communities together. So it's our role to think of all of that, but it's also our role to think of what the intergovernmental organs of the United Nations can do. What can the Security Council do? What can the Human Rights Council do? What can the General Assembly do? And essentially bring those issues to the table of those organs with specific recommendations for them. None less importantly, it's also our role to think of, what those who are not representatives of governments or regional or international organizations can do. What can civil society do? What can media do? What can community leaders do? What can religious leaders do? In a nutshell, that's part of our daily job when we try to, again, identify those risk factors and identify entry points to address them in the way that we think can be helpful to strengthen this collective capacity to prevent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. And Greg, you have experience not only in academia, but also in practice and really so much experience over a long period of time. Would you like to share your thoughts on the post-World War II building of a liberal world order, inclusive of the creation of the UN, and what that means in terms of prevention of mass atrocity? How did you teach about it? How did you implement that in practice through different instances of the working for the federal government and so on? Could you share your thoughts on genocide in 20th century, specifically post-World War II timeframe?
Sure. I want to first thank Mario for his work at the Special Advisor's Office in the UN. In fact, it was Genocide Watch and the Alliance Against Genocide that first proposed creation of that office, because we realized the UN didn't have a specialized office to really predict and suggest prevention measures for genocide. I remember when East Timor was, it was experiencing massacres, and we did call the UN, and we kept getting shuttled around from one office to another. And, we realized then that we needed a focal point. And so that is what, in fact, Mario's office is so helpful in doing. Now, he also said, and I completely agree with this, that genocide is a process. It's not an event. You can see it coming. In fact, a lot of the basic processes that lead to genocide can be seen long before a genocide actually occurs. For instance, as he said, this process of dehumanization, which comes about in hate speech, polarization of the population through that same thing, that hate speech, discrimination, systematic discrimination against a particular group, the attempts to actually plan a genocide, as you've said, Mirjana, in the Wannsee conference that occurred shortly after the Babi Yar massacre. By the way, there is a film about that conference. It was actually made from the transcript of the conference. The Nazis tried to destroy all the transcripts, but they failed to destroy one copy. And this film called Conspiracy, I highly recommend to everyone to see. It will send chills up and down your spine. So, in fact, as Professor Berkhoff has said, I am convinced that the Nazi program was well set forth long before the Holocaust actually began. I think Hitler made it very clear, his intention, in Mein Kampf. In fact, when Winston Churchill was asked why it was that he understood the Nazis so much better than Chamberlain and some of the others in the British government, he answered, I read Mein Kampf. Sometimes these intentionalities are made very clear. However, as you've pointed out, Mirjana, one of the problems that people have with the Genocide Convention is it requires that it defines genocide as the intentional destruction, in whole or in part, of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Now, one can see intent, especially in individual criminal trials, but how do you determine intent for a state? Because states don't have minds. They don't have mens rea. Well, I would argue this, that if there are foreseeable consequences of a systematic pattern of state actions that would lead to genocide, that is enough proof for state intent. It's the only way you can prove state intent. In other words, you have to look at the consequences of the state's actions. Well, Babi Yar was a clear indicator of the Nazi state's intent. Now, one of the troubling things about Babi Yar was that, and by the way, I've been to Babi Yar. I went to, I looked over the edge of into the ravine with Stepan Kamara, who was one of the leaders of the independence movement in Ukraine. A really great man, and a man who I was involved with when we were advocating for independence of Ukraine from 88 to 92. And one of the things that is so troubling about Babi Yar, and Yevtushenko, in his famous poem, Babi Yar in 1961, made clear, was that there was an attempt to deny it, to not recognize it, to treat it not as the crime that it was. And in fact, as he put it in the beginning of his poem on Babi Yar, there are no monuments at Babi Yar. Well, now there are, but his poem was a clear example of denial. And that is one of the worst attributes of genocide. It's part of the genocidal process that you find in every genocide. So you'll have these other terms being used for genocidal activities. For instance, and the most common one, by the way, now is ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is a term invented by Slobodan Milosevic. What he really was talking about was forced displacement and genocide. Both of these are crimes. The term ethnic cleansing is not even outlawed by any treaty. It's not even illegal under international law. It's, of course, it is a really strong indicator of genocidal behavior and of forced displacement, which often goes along with genocide. So when the Rohingya, for instance, were being displaced from the area that they live in, Rakhine State in Myanmar, you could see it coming. In 2012, Genocide Watch said this is genocide. But the press and most human rights groups and others refused to call it that right up to about 2017, when there was the obvious forcing out and murder of at least 30,000 Rohingya. So what we have is a lot of examples and where there's this denial. The same thing happened, and I can speak from experience here too, in Cambodia. People didn't want to admit that the Khmer Rouge were going to commit genocide. And so, and I was part of the anti-war movement, by the way, and I thought it was a huge mistake what we did in Vietnam and Cambodia, the US and others. But by denying that the Khmer Rouge were about to commit genocide, we opened the way for it. When George McGovern realized this, who was also anti-war, he asked for an international intervention. It wasn't, as you know, until 1979 that the Vietnamese, the very same Vietnamese who had defeated the US, finally did intervene to stop that genocide. So we have many cases of genocide, but there's also this terrible problem of denial, of not wanting to face the facts that genocide has occurred or is about to occur.
Thank you, Greg. And I would, we don't have that much time, but I would like to also briefly talk about the causes. I mean, we see many, if not most, of the modern case studies are centered around the state as the perpetrator. Not all of them, but in the West, most of them. The causes, in this case, with the Nazi Germany example, isn't it? So it's about the living space. It is anti-Semitism, but it's basically about the living space. It's about the resources and so on. That it's nothing new in a way. Could anyone briefly want to comment on some other possible causes very briefly, because we are running out of time? And do we have any success stories in preventing genocides? Because we learn about them and they happen, isn't it? So we don't learn about those that were perhaps avoided. So maybe very briefly, if either Mari or Greg would share their thoughts with us.
I do think we have some success stories. And by the way, the only US Secretary of State who's ever understood genocide is Madeleine Albright. And it's probably because she came from Eastern Europe. But she, under her, a genocide was stopped in Kosovo. Under her, a genocide was stopped in Bosnia. And also, under her, a genocide was stopped in East Timor. In each of those cases, regional organizations were able to organize military responses that stopped the genocide. It's unfortunate that the UN right now is so paralyzed by the Perm 5 veto in the Security Council that it's very unusual to have a UN intervention that does stop a genocide. But in the case of Kosovo and Bosnia, it was NATO. In the case of East Timor, it was the ASEAN that did it. And I say you could point to another success in West Africa, where the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, stopped genocides in Sierra Leone and in Liberia.
So from what we are learning today, and maybe we could go to Mario, we are learning that, trying to prevent genocide or even stop it once it is underway, it's a complex matter here. It doesn't depend only on the state within which it's happening or the broader region or the UN for that matter, isn't it? So there are so many layers of international relations, balance of power, regional dynamics, and so on. Mario, what is your office doing, and not only your office, but the UN? I know that around 2002, you embarked on a process of modernization of so many, isn't it, so parts of the entire, United Nations. What do you think should be done, or what are you doing to be able to better address and, prevent or have your recommendations produce better outcomes in a way? What is being done? Could you share with us briefly what is going on in that regard?
Yeah, thank you, Mirjana, for the question. And it's, of course, genocide prevention can be highly political, as you can imagine. In a place like the UN, saying certain things publicly become very political. The states have different political interests. Representatives of states rightly represent their positions, their legitimate positions in the forums of the UN. So it's a very very hard undertaking. But then again, it's a matter of trying to identify where are the entry points. And what's the window of prevention? I mean, I think part of the excellent work of Professor Stenton has showed us that there are many entry points before the risk becomes immediate or before the crime is in a situation where it is being committed. Once you reach that stage, essentially, if you allow me the expression, the ball is on the court of the intergovernmental organs, most particularly the Security Council, which, as Professor Stenton was saying, is often paralyzed in these most difficult political issues. But then again, before you reach that stage, there are things that you can do to try to bring communities together in a place where they're divided. There are things you can do to try to build institutions of rule of law. Within the risk factors that we look at, one of those, for example, is absence of mitigating factors. We think that the risk of commission is higher when there are no mitigating factors. Now, what are the mitigating factors? Well, does the country have a powerful National Human Rights Commission, for example, that it's legitimate and accepted by everyone? Mm-hmm. How about an electoral commission that everyone accepts as the final ruler in the outcome of an election, which we know traditionally can be a triggering point for this kind of situations? No? So my general point is the farther you are from the actual risk of commission, the broader the windows of entry to try to do things about it. But then again, the harder it is to put a label of risk of genocide, because it's not obvious to everyone that you are in that situation. And many people will feel uncomfortable putting that label, if you allow me the expression, on that situation, because they will claim, this is only a human rights situation. This is only a, peace building post-conflict situation, or reconciliation, transitional justice situation. So it's our job, sorry, just to finalize, because I know we're running out of time. It's our job to basically pack up things in a way that we demonstrate that that we think that we have solid reasons to believe that the risk exists based on the presence of factors that have been present in past instances of commission of this crime in other places. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Mario. And before we move to the question and answer segment, and we have some wonderful questions I see there, I would like to briefly say that, we focus today, even though it's a short, time frame that we had on the 20th century, the genocide, but we also should be thinking about genocide in the 21st century, and also look at genocide not only through the, traditional kind of interpretation or looking for the causes, but also how climate change will affect the episodes of mass atrocity, how will it actually lead to them. And climate change can be a possible conduit to mass killings in the 21st century in a way that we have not seen before. There is science denial, there is possible ecological panic, food uncertainty, water scarcity, and so on. We don't have time to talk about that today, but Timothy Snyder of Yale wrote a wonderful book on that particular topic you may want to look at. And let us now shift to the question and answer segment. There are a number of questions here that are really great. And could you maybe briefly tell us Andrei or Karel, Beth Scott is asking, what was the Soviet response, if any, to the massacre, both immediately after and in the years following? And then the other question by Brian Siegel, has any significant memorial been erected on the site of Babi Yar? And we know, Andrei, because you are part of the, isn't this infrastructure, that it has, where the bodies moved later during the war. That part I would like you maybe to address, Andrei, first and second question. Thank you.
Okay, concerning the monuments, concerning the museums, I can say that right now, exactly, Babyn Yar ravine does not exist anymore. It was destroyed by Soviets after World War II. The ravine, which was 50 meters deep and 2.5 kilometers long, was filled with waste, with the liquid waste of brick-producing factories. And right now, the former ravine turned into park. And trees were planted in this park. So if right now you come to the place where ravine existed before, you will never recognize the terrain. It's totally different. So if Nazis killed people, Soviets, they killed the memory and they killed the place of mass atrocities. Right now in this park, which is called Babyn Yar National Park, there are almost 30 different monuments, but all these monuments, they are not united into one ensemble, and still there is no museum of Babyn Yar, unfortunately. And right now in Ukraine, among Ukrainian society, it's a big discussion, very hot discussion about what kind of museum should be erected there, what kind of memorial should be erected in the Babyn Yar, and how the atrocities should be presented within this future memorial. So it's still, discussion still goes on, and I hope that in the foreseeable future it will be finished, and hopefully we will receive a European standard modern museum, which is to memorize the memory about the victims of Babyn Yar. So this is the answer to the first part of the question. So this is the Soviets' response. The Soviet ideology remembered about the killing of people, but those people, they were not regarded as the Jewish. They were regarded as the part of the big Soviet people. They were part of the Soviet people, and that's why the Holocaust was not mentioned by the Soviet ideology at all, because Soviet Union was populated by Soviet people, but not with Russians, Ukrainians, Jewish, etc. They were the country, the state was populated by the Soviets, and that's why it was not good for state ideology to say something about the Jewish, for example, tragedy, and that's why Soviets, they killed terrain intentionally. Just in order people, next generation will come and they will not see any ravine, they will not see any place where all these killings happened. So, and right now we still cannot imagine how this place looked like 80 years before, and it's quite difficult to explain, for example, the modern Ukrainian school children that biggest tragedy happened in a very peaceful and very quiet and very, I would say, green park area within the downtown of modern city of Kyiv. So we are still combating the Soviet memory policy heritage, unfortunately, and still big discussion is on.
So I would say it's definitely also about a physical erasure, isn't it, so of memory, because there is so little, basically nothing left of the ravine, which was more than a kilometer long, isn't it so? And
2.5 kilometers long.
Yes, and I'm aware that your the website of the museum, isn't it so, where you're working, has a number of images. If anyone is interested, could visit the website and look actually at how the site looked like at the time. Karel, would you mind taking this next question by David? Are there any eyewitness testimonies by the perpetrators of the Babyn Yar and other massacres in Ukraine by the perpetrators? How do they explain their actions, mindset, etc.?
For Kiev, there are hundreds of testimonies. They were taken by German investigators mostly. these men, and they're all men, they didn't end up in the courtroom. The number of people who were at the site in late September and who faced the courtroom is incredibly small. And this had to do with a very narrow interpretation of responsibility. These days, and this started in Germany as well, we realized that if a perpetrator cannot be, if a member of a killing unit cannot be demonstrated to have literally killed a person, it doesn't mean that that person can just leave the room and go on with his life. I mean, we're now more aware these are communities of violence, but in decades past, this was not how judges and legal experts acted. So we have lots of these testimonies, and most of the men, the vast majority, either say, I wasn't there, or I was there, but I was standing guard, I didn't shoot. You do have some who actually admit that they killed, and then they say, well, I just had to do it. It was just my obligation. Regret is never there. The only regret one encounters is, I felt so bad at the time, and today it gives me nightmares. That's the kind of regret that these people usually express.
Thank you. And we have another question by Taylor Kerr. Several Slavic countries, Poland, have tried to obfuscate their histories of Nazi collaboration and participation in the Holocaust. How does the panel view the responsibility of Eastern European nations like Poland and Ukraine in this genocide? And what is the proper framework for these nations to understand this history? Were they acts of occupiers or homegrown atrocities? I would like either Andrei or Karel maybe to address, or even Greg to join us, but we have only 2 more minutes left. So briefly, if you would address the question.
Okay, if very briefly, just some comments. We have always keep in mind that almost 6 or 7 million Ukrainians, they fought against the Nazis within the ranks of the Red Army or US Army or Canadian Army or Polish Armed Forces during World War II, and only only maybe 50,000 people from Ukraine, they served within German police battalions, and they took place in a different kind of atrocities, and totally maybe about 200,000 or 300,000 Ukrainians totally served under the ranks of the Nazi army. So if we compare these numbers, we see that most of Ukrainians, they fought against the Nazism, and plus this fact we always have to keep in mind that the same situation is with Poland. So I do not like to say about the collective responsibility of the whole nation. Let's talk about the personal responsibility of those perpetrators. Let's talk about the responsibility of some specific groups of perpetrators from the local population. And I can say that right now Ukrainian historians, they are quite brave to start this kind of investigation and write the articles and books. So there is nothing to hide, and it's already different times. It's not the Soviet times when the truth of history was hidden, and people know only about the good things of the World War II, but they didn't know about the bad things of the World War II. Right now, it's a totally different situation now in Ukraine, and so there are many works, many texts about the collaborators among the local populations. By the way, if we are saying about the local populations, local collaborators, we also have to keep in our mind that not all locals were Ukrainian by their nationality. Locals means Russians, locals means even German colonies who populated the south part of Ukraine, for example. They actively collaborated with other Germans who came from the Third Reich. So it's quite complicated question, but I say once more, we have no propaganda obstacles or ideological obstacles to hide something. So we openly speak about it and publish our works. And I hope many texts will be translated into English, so the wide audience in the whole world will be able to get acquainted with them and will receive more information on this subject. So this is my short answer on this quite complicated question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrei, for that. And I would just like to mention Miranda Lang, you asked about book suggestions. Our own Karel Berkhoff wrote a wonderful book, Harvest of Despair. I would say that would be a good starting point. And feel free to send me an email, miranda@morosini@american.edu, and I can offer other recommendations. We are out of time. I wish we had more time. This has been an amazing panel, and thank you to our panelists as well as to those who joined us, and the questions that have been asked by audience were absolutely wonderful. Kate, thank you for helping us set this up, and we hope you can join us for the next SIS event on October 12th. We will host our next SIS Global. Here it is. Kate is sharing with you the information, and please take a look.